So we're going to talk about sexual harassment. Josh Friedman is going to talk about that. It gets very complicated, especially in these team drivers. It's not all, the solution is not that we need more female trainers. Frankly, some of the female trainers are worse than the men. Okay, what it has to do with is if you are a good trainer, and you should be training. It doesn't matter what gender that you are. So the other thing I want to point out too is a lot of times when the police get involved, they assume it's domestic violence rather than workplace violence because it's extremely difficult to explain to law enforcement why on earth would you be on a truck with a man you don't know. And trying to explain that to an officer that your company put you in that situation and you're trying to start a new job, it's almost impossible. So we really want to clarify a lot of that. So I'm asking you guys to listen to Josh as he talks about his cases. I'm going to move to the back of the room. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself, and I'm asking you to help us change this industry.
Hi folks, I'm Josh Friedman of Friedman & Holding. Our firm exclusively represents victims of sexual and racial harassment in class actions and multi-plaintiff cases. And this is all we've done since 2003. First of all, I'd like to thank Desiree and Real Women in Trucking. I encourage everybody to join and support the organization. Desiree asked me to speak about a case that our firm brought in 2015 called Sellers versus CRST. And just to, I think, give you a feel for what this case is about, I'll tell you how it all got started. I was sitting in my office, minding my own business. The phone rang, and a woman told me a horrible story. She worked for CRST Expedited, which is one of the team driving companies, the largest one, I believe. She had been sexually assaulted by 3 separate trainers or co-drivers. She had had weapons pulled on her, and it was a horror story. And then, coincidentally, I assumed, we got another call from another woman who had also been sexually assaulted by 3 separate trainers or drivers, also while working at CRST. So I thought, perhaps we can help. They expressed an interest in the possibility of settling their claims. I made an inquiry. And CRST said, yeah, great, yeah, let's settle them. In the meanwhile, I just did a little background checking. And to my surprise, I found that in 2007, the EEOC had brought a case on behalf of 270 women who had been raped, sexually assaulted, or sexually harassed while working at CRST. And based on the documents that were available in the court archives, it was clear that this problem had existed since the early 2000s, that at least one driver had been convicted of rape. What happened in that case was it was dismissed. And all 270 of those women were left without the opportunity for justice. Why it was dismissed isn't really important. The bottom line was, I thought, well, let me ask these women whether they experienced any of the same types of events that were described in the EEOC case. And sure enough, they did. They told me that when male drivers sexually harassed women, the only thing that happened to them is they were assigned the status of, quote, no women. That was it. And the drivers who had sexually assaulted them, or the trainers, were still going around and doing whatever they were doing without any consequence. It became apparent that there had been essentially an epidemic of sexual assault at CRST that had started a decade ago. And even though it's extremely difficult to get a court to accept a class action where the events in question occur all over the United States, as is the case when you're talking about a trucking company, my partner and I decided we had a moral obligation to ask the two women we were talking to, let's not settle this, let's do something about this. Let's ask the court to certify a class action. Let's get an injunction to put an end to this. And let's actually get compensation for all of the women who are a member of our class for the sexual assaults that they've suffered. And she said, yeah, we should do it. And ultimately 3 women agreed to act as lead plaintiffs. Now, it is very difficult to get a class action certified. You have to show that there are common policies that led to the sexual harassment. Well, let me mention one name. That's Karen Carlson. And you'll notice that there's a slide up right now. The lead attorney in our firm, Giselle Schutz, took Karen Carlson's deposition. Karen is the head of employee relations. And she testified that CRST had a policy that it didn't deem any claim of sexual harassment corroborated unless there was either a witness or a confession. Now, virtually all of these sexual assaults and sexual harassment occurred in a truck cab built for 2, so there are not going to be any witnesses. And confessions, well, the only time you had confessions was just the result of the poor training that CRST did. A lot of the men that were engaging in sexual harassment didn't know it was illegal. So they said, yeah, I did that. Essentially, I felt what it amounted to was a policy of just not believing women. The other piece of incredible testimony that we got is Ms. Carlson told us that each time a driver was accused of sexual harassment, it basically presented an entirely new scenario. And even if he had been the subject of prior uncorroborated complaints, that they were not considered at all. So if you put all that together, you've got a policy of never corroborating complaints, and then you've got a policy of not considering prior uncorroborated complaints, which really boils down to a policy of never disciplining anybody for engaging in sexual assault or sexual harassment. Because of this testimony, the court in Iowa, where we brought this case, decided to certify a class of 270 women who had either been raped, sexually assaulted, or sexually harassed. That case is pending right now. And he held that CRST's own policies could, if a jury concluded that they were in fact those policies, actually explain why all this horrible, horrible violence against women was happening. And as Desiree mentioned, the files in this case have now been unsealed, and there's some very, very startling stuff that you can see. The types of sexual harassment that are typical are, well, it stems from the model that a lot of these trainer or joint team driving companies have. They'll pay for your training in school, for your CDL, and then they're going to put you out on the road for 28 days with your trainer. You're going to be alone in a cab for 28 days with somebody you've never met before, who will, in all likelihood, be a man, because the vast majority of trainers are men. That person will have sole discretion whether or not you pass. That means whether or not you get to go on and make money. And you already owe your company about $3,000 for that training, which requires you to work for them for 8 months under contract, and it prevents you from working for any other trucking company during those 8 months. So as you can imagine, these trainers have an enormous amount of power over the women whom they're training. What was very, very typical was for a trainer to demand sexual favors in return for passing. Sometimes they didn't even bother to demand, they just took what they wanted. Extremely vulgar, to the point of threatening. Verbal sexual harassment was common, of the nature of, this is what I'm going to do to you, with an explicit description, including anatomy. And there were other types of things that were, I wouldn't call them subtle, but escorting a woman trainee into a truck stop and introducing her to people as his, quote, road wife. This was all very, very common. What I'd like to talk about is what you should do if you're confronted with this type of behavior. The first thing is think about safety. If you're feeling threatened by your co-driver or your trainer, find a way to separate yourself from that person immediately. It might involve stopping and making an excuse that you are going to grab some food at a truck stop, calling the police from there. There are a lot of different ways you could do it, but whatever it takes, do it. The second thing probably that would cross your mind is getting in touch with human resources immediately. Well, there are 3 ancient lies. One of them, the check is in the mail. The other one, my wife doesn't love me. And the third one is, we're from human resources, we're here to help. That is not what human resources is for. Human resources exists to protect the company from liability. And what I saw in the CRST case is that even when the amazingly demanding standard of a confession or a witness was met, in about half those cases, the Human Resources Department literally ignored that evidence in their investigation and found the complaint not corroborated. So you definitely don't want to get in touch with Human Resources first, because a lot of the women in this case found out that they ended up being fired after making a complaint. What you want to do is speak to an attorney, not necessarily to bring a lawsuit, but what you want is, you want advice on preserving evidence that you've been sexually harassed, so that if and when you do go to Human Resources, you're not going to get this wasn't corroborated. You can force the company to do something about it, and you can prevent them from retaliating against you. Oftentimes that involves preserving text messages. It may involve advice from the attorney about recording a conversation that's going on between yourself and a trainer. And there are a lot of other steps that you could take to make sure that when you make that complaint, that you're going to be believed and the company's going to be forced to do something about it. There are several other companies, probably 5 or 10, that follow the team training model. We've gotten a fair number of calls from people who work for them, and it's my opinion that those companies have similar problems to CRST. If you're working for one of those companies or thinking about it, beware of the story that I've told you. If you're experiencing problems like that, get in touch with us so that we can give you some advice. We'll be happy just to give you advice about what's going on. It's not necessary that you bring a lawsuit. If you'd like to know more about the CRST case, I think you all know Donna and Alan's show, Ask the Trucker. They have an interesting website that ABC News 2020 put up about the case, including interviews with some of the victims. Also, there's actually an email blast going out courtesy of GATS today, which has a link to that as well. Again, my appreciation to Real Women in Trucking. They did a great deal for us in helping us to organize this case, and I really emphasize that it's important that we all support them. Thank you.